Okay, we are now live. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us yet again for another Stream for Science talk between Rupeethon and March for Science. We're going to be talking about climate science again, especially given the recent UN report from the IPCC talking about climate change and the climate crisis. So, without further ado, just a quick round of introductions. You guys have remember me. I'm Steve. I'm from Rupeethon. I've been hosting these streams ever since, and you guys may remember from the other side. There we go. Arrows in the right direction. Ingrid from March for Science, who has been joining us all these weeks. We have a new special guest this week. I'd like to introduce from the other side is John, who is.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, if you'd like to introduce yourself, John.
Sure. Okay, so my name is John. I have just finished my Master in Public Administration with a focus on climate policy and most specifically climate policy at subnational levels, and study on kind of more, I would say, palatable to conservative policies that may be a good starting point for the 2020s while we ramp up towards more decarbonization to hit the Paris goals in time for 2050. I also have a bachelor's degree in history and a professional background in logistics and transportation. So I can talk a lot about a lot of stuff that's very climate adjacent, and also a historical perspective on certainly some of the struggles that previous civilizations have had with climate change. Not to the degree we're experiencing today, but I think we're also a bit more technologically prepared for handling the consequences at least, but there are still lessons from history that I think are good to keep in mind, especially to kind of keep ourselves sane in dealing with some of the scary stuff. So that's it for me. Back to you, Steve.
Sweet. No, it's great having you here, John. John and I are both members of Rupeethon, so if you followed us our live streams before when we raised money for charity, you might have seen him, I don't know, at like 4 a.m. battling through the water temple of Ocarina of Time while we're getting donations. So thank you all for joining us again as we now discuss essentially what the heck just happened. So if you're not familiar, the UN just released its 6th climate report. We call this the it's a report on it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as the official organ of the UN to discuss climate science and how we disseminate climate information and research. And in the past 31 years, they've only released now 6 reports, pretty much establishing what is the current status of our global warming, our climate change initiatives, and where do we stand as a planet facing what is essentially a massive climate emergency. So it's a big deal when these drop because it's only once every 6-7 years. I think the last one was 2014. That was AR5. And yeah, it's there's a couple new updates, I guess you could say, that are really jarring. Do you guys have any specific initial takeaways, just like going into this, reading this report, any of the things that kind of updated you? I know it's always very much like, oh God, it's a lot of overwhelming numbers. And I mean, it's like a 1,000-page report, but a lot of things going on, etc. But was there anything that really struck you about this report versus what you thought about the climate emergency beforehand?
John, you can go ahead first. Yeah.
Okay. So I think for me, the thing that kind of jumped out at me was that the extremes of the report, both the top temperature we might reach by 2100, and of course the minimum temperature, have kind of narrowed a little bit. So I think certainly from the climatological perspective, and this is something a bit out of my wheelhouse, it seems like we're at least narrowing an idea of knowing exactly what we're dealing with. And the other thing I found really encouraging was that they seem to think that some of the policies that have already been put in place are going to have us on the right path. And I think the fact that we still have momentum towards these policies, especially in Europe, and even starting to grow here, the Senate, I know, just passed something that at least does something for climate change, especially on electric vehicles. I think there's some room for optimism among all the other terrifying things like hitting feedback loops and we've already exceeded the 1.5 degree Celsius goal. There's very little we can do short of replanting forests all over everything.
Right.
Yeah, I think similarly to John, but maybe like maybe from a different point of view, I was really struck by how like even the smallest fractional like there I think there was like a line in the policy summary where it was like every single like ton of CO2 matters. And I think that yeah, when it comes to like climate action and climate policy, like I always think about like yeah, like the big overarching like really truly overwhelming at times issue that we have at hand. But like to what John said, like there are things that even if they are incremental, are leading us in the right direction. But now it's like, you know, that the urgency is truly, I mean, has always been, but it's like truly there for us to just like, you know, like the time for fossil fuels is just it's like bye bye.
It's
It's over.
it's done.
It's over.
Yeah.
It's over. Like yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. Like if we didn't know it before, we truly know it
Yeah.
now. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. I think the thing that struck me the most about this report is how clear cut it was. There was no more if this, or not if, there was no more maybe, possibly. It was unequivocally humans have caused climate change and we're the only ones that can reverse it or mitigate it in any way, shape, or form. It's no longer a high certainty of humans causing climate change. Anthropogenic climate change is a thing, and it's been fully acknowledged in this report without a doubt, which is, to me, was very surprising. I really did not expect that, but given everything that's happened in the past 7 years since the last report, I think it's at the bare minimum worthy of it. So for sure, that was very interesting. And also, I mean, in the last report, they started to outline different pathways and how the current amount of carbon dioxide and different pollutants in the atmosphere are interplay with the socioeconomic ways in which we create policies and we interact with our environment, such as how much we emit, emissions, etc. So it's kind of like now you're seeing how these kind of play out, and it was almost a little reassuring where they, like I think John said, like things are starting to narrow. We don't think we'll see as much from the feedback loops as was terrifyingly acknowledged last time, but it's still a high risk. And even without such a feedback loop, and by feedback loop I mean if we start to remit more carbon, that might cause more issues where, say, ice caps melt, you release more material from these ice caps that can detriment our ecosystems, etc. Even without that, it's still very, very jarring and terrifying at just what kind of world we'll be looking at with massive heat waves and temperature spikes. Yeah, it's just wild how clear this report felt, or at least how the summaries felt like, okay, we have kind of an outline now of what we're expecting. So for sure. Yeah. Do you guys have any other thoughts on, in general, specifically, I would say, I just had a word for it. I just completely lost it. I apologize. In your experiences dealing with climate policy at these levels, like at a, I'm sorry, no, John's looking at me like a weird word. I'm like, I lost my train of thought. I apologize. Backing myself up, excuse me. So
Am I making you uncomfortable by staring like this, Steve?
Yeah, there you go. I'm looking at John, I'm like, all right, I just lost my train of thought. Excuse me, backing that up. So talking about like the climate policies we have currently going towards it. So John, you mentioned like we have policies in place and the report is starting to look like we might actually have some chance of this, and we might be on the right track. Is there anything in particular that you really feel passionate about or you want to discuss that you think we're doing right so far? Those are the words I was looking for.
Yeah, okay. So I want to go with two different things. The first is there's just been a huge upswell in cities and states that are adopting policy. Oregon just passed a cap and trade policy, and I know it was meant to way back in 2006 to match the one California has. But they finally got it done, and they're taking now public commentary to actually set up the regulations and set up this carbon exchange. And right now the policy is written such that they'll hit 80% reduction from 2005 levels by 2050. So not perfect, but again, a very good stepping stone, especially knowing the success that California's had with theirs. And then and this one I was going to save to the end, but since you brought it up, Boise, Idaho has passed a climate policy to hit neutrality by 2050. Right now, it's just a draft document. It is still very much in its infancy as terms of actually hitting a plan, but it's a mandate that was passed by the mayor's office. And they're going to try and free market the whole thing. And for reference to anyone who's not familiar with Idaho politics, Boise is, despite being a city which leans liberal, only voted 49% for Biden in 2020. So it is, it's probably the most conservative large city. It's about 750,000 people. And they're looking at a lot of kind of public works that are generally popular. Planting more trees, looking at a solar subsidy. Don't think they're going to go with carbon pricing just yet, but other stuff like painting roofs white and just having that simple mandate. Looking more at urban density, closing streets to cars. Looking at bringing in electric car infrastructure, especially with the announcement of the F-150 electric version. So these kind of things, I think a lot of people, even those super on the right, have been denying it, starting to wake up and at the very least seeing opportunity for it. The other thing I want to touch on is the news that actually just dropped a couple days ago, where the main private power company in England now estimates that they are going to be carbon neutral for electricity generation in 2034 if they keep on their current trend. And worth noting that Boris Johnson is often compared to Donald Trump as far as leadership, but he has always been, since I've been following, he was the mayor of London back about 10 years ago. He has always been, kind of a jerk, but very much on climate.
Oh, absolutely.
Oftentimes bucking his own party to do so. So I think we're starting to see the cracks form in not actually doing anything. There's good stuff happening.
Yeah. Funny thing you mentioned about Bojo is that I think he was the first. Bojo.
That's his big day. Everything about him is just goofy.
One of the first, I think he might have been one of the first European heads of state to actually have a reaction to the UN report. Like he first was like, "This is real emergency. Like heads up. Like this is a thing." So it's incredible.
Also, the largest expansion of bike lanes in any major city to date. And he did that probably 12, 13 years ago.
Yeah. I think he is a cyclist too. I remember watching a Top Gear episode. I know we're getting off track, but I just remember the episode of him being a cyclist. Sorry, let's roll back to Boise, which is my new country record. So if we're talking about the Boise implementations as like, so simple things like painting your roof white. If you're not familiar with that, should a pretty straightforward, easy thing to do. Of when you have a white roof versus a black roof, your white roof will reflect the sunlight much more readily than a black roof, which will absorb the light. It'll warm your house. So when you're talking about like hot summers, you have a black roof, it's going to heat your house more. You're going to need more AC. AC is energy, etc. It's just kind of like a general mitigation strategy. And these are like simple things that people don't really think about in terms of policy. But it seems like it's not just they're focusing on that. They have, you said, electric vehicles, infrastructure, planting more trees is very simple, but also a really important thing. I wouldn't say, in my personal thought, like the biomass of trees in one city would do much to mitigate all of a city's emissions, but it doesn't hurt. It's a step in the right direction. And we're at that point where like Ingrid said, we're on a climate budget now. We're on a carbon budget. We only have about 500 billion? Or no, it wasn't 500 billion. It was like 5 billion tons. I lost the exact number. But we have about, from pre-industrial levels, we've used up, I would say, 85% of all the carbon. We've emitted 85% of all the total carbon we can emit before we hit 1.5 C warming. So that's where I'm going with that. Numbers, lots of numbers. I'm a scientist. I'm good with numbers, I swear.
Yeah, I have a question for John. And I know you mentioned that you focus on subnational policy, but I guess my thing is always like, as someone who's only done really work like maybe in like New York City and like New Jersey, which is like where I grew up around climate, I'm always like, I love to see like when mayors especially like step up and like they work with city councils to put together legislation like that really affects like local cities, like like New York, of course, like Jersey City where I'm from, or Boise. but how do you have a sense of like how these efforts can scale from like one district to the other up to the state level, in a way that is maybe like cohesive, towards the same goal, but still understanding enough of like each local district in a way. Do you know what I mean? Because climate will look different from one place. Yeah.
So I think, well, for a place like Boise is probably not the best example for what you're asking, because half the state live there. But for a place like New York, I think in many ways having a strong city allows, because like New York accounts for what is it?
Ugh.
I knew the exact number at some point, but like, let's just say, throw it out there, 50% of the New York carbon emissions. In ways that, like, if you focus on these big population centers, and all right, we reduce New York City's carbon by half, that's 25% of New York's right there.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, I think a lot of people are like, all right, let's think big. But there's so much that can be done in just these small areas that will have a profound impact. Because you look at, and I'll bring California in. It is 12% of the US population. They have reduced their annual electricity carbon output by 60 megatons in the last 10 years. That's every year, 60 megatons less. And that really adds up. And that has taken down America's share in the global output by about 1%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I love that framing, actually.
Yeah.
And also in many ways, that small cities tend to, if you have a program that's worked for 10, 15 years in a city, other cities will start looking at it and pulling it up. So they'll say, oh, well, New York City's done this. Let's do it for Los Angeles. That's an easy win, second largest city in the country. Same with Chicago, Houston. And then I think the example I like to bring in from history is that we all tend to focus, and it's the way we're taught, is, President Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. But abolition in the United States started in the early 1700s, went colony by colony, state by state. Individual cities, it became the fight as new states were added. Are we going to allow slavery here? And that was where the real abolition fight was taking place, before it was uploaded. Same thing with women's suffrage. The first state to pass women's suffrage was Wyoming, almost 40 years before the 19th Amendment, or 18th Amendment. Don't have them all quite memorized.
I think
19th, yeah. And even more recently, Obamacare was based off of Massachusetts plan. So I think using local initiatives, New York City initiatives, New York State initiatives, will eventually inspire the national policy or the international policy. And it's kind of one of those, like, all right, keep your eye on the prize. That's the 2050. But for now, what can we do this year is let's create the policy and prove that it works. And then we can bring it to a greater region.
Yeah.
So I think the local, and I think this is something Democrats are much weaker on than Republicans in general. Focus local. Win the elections locally. Focus on the state houses. That's like, you're going to have a lot easier time getting through it because people pay less attention. There's going to be less resistance.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how it is. But
Yeah.
use it to your advantage when you can.
Mm-hmm. So my thought is then, I have actually another question. How do you feel about, so that's, I'd say, going from like a lower level up to a higher level, start small, go big for policy. But what if that doesn't work? How do you feel about, there's been a lot of different lawsuits. I think there's like 1,000 current lawsuits against states, cities, corporations on climate. And in my experience, I mean, I just know that, example of gay marriage. Gay marriage was starting to be accepted long before 2015 with Obergefell versus Hodges. Where I think Massachusetts was the first state to legalize gay marriage, and then it was just state by state. And then finally it kind of be like, this is ridiculous. Now we have our Supreme Court case, like, close the book, everybody's now free for it. Do you think we have any hope in that, or is that just kind of a dead end, or what do you think could possibly happen from there with climate litigation?
It goes either way. And I'm going to point to the one that we just won a couple months ago against Shell in the Netherlands. That happened less than 48 hours later. Two other companies, I think it was Exxon and BP, don't quote me on that though, immediately shifted their goals and their outlook for the next 10 years to align themselves with Paris for the 2030 stage of Paris. I think it's a route that absolutely should pay attention to. And again, judges are important. We learned that very, very hard way last year. But I would still say overwhelmed with legislation, because you want to get the legislation out because that forces them onto the defensive. They have to go through the courts, which is going to be slower.
Mm-hmm. No, that's fair.
So there are victories to be had, but I think legislative is still the fastest option.
Right.
Especially if you're in a state with a good Supreme Court.
We do have a question. Thank you, Rumpelstiltskin. Skilton, excuse me. Hi, Rupeethoners. While government can facilitate positive environmental climate change, I believe that corporate America must lead the effort. Pressure from shareholders and consumers to shift to more climate-friendly practices would be more effective to foster change. It wasn't really a question. It was more of a comment.
Yeah.
But no, that's a good...
Definitely. And I think we're also seeing that happen. There was an insurgency there was another petrol company where shareholders actually elected 2 full-on energy transition activists to the corporate board. And likewise, the shareholders have been putting increasing pressure on Ford to get on the electric vehicle market, especially with the success we saw with Tesla. So that is happening as well. And I think especially as millennials start to get older and start to actually have money, we're going to begin seeing a lot more activation, a lot more money, and also getting into management levels. Now that many of us have had careers for 10 years, I think we're really going to start seeing shifts. As we've been kicked around for 30 years. It's our turn. We want to make this transformation happen.
Yeah, and absolutely, I believe that electric cars are like the perfect example, because it's a thing that most Americans own at some point as a vehicle, and so it's kind of like a catch-22 is the word I'm looking for. So you need to have the technology in place in order to start to mandate it and be able to make it a thing, either through legislation or through just in general a positive push. But at the same time, if there's no kind of drive for it, no pun intended, from a legislative side towards, like you say, climate goals, nobody's going to really want to put the money into investing in electric vehicles. It's almost like we made electric vehicles cool and there was like a spark towards it. I think a lot of it was like the collective conscious of like, we know these are better for the environment overall in the long run. We know there's a lot of issues now with electric cars, but we're still doing better off than fossil fuels. So I definitely think like now you have a lot of innovation and competition in electric vehicles, which we didn't see 5-6 years ago, barring Volkswagen's issues with what we call Dieselgate now, which forces them legally into electric vehicles. Now we're seeing the Chevy Volt, the Ford F-150, which nobody can stop talking about. Everyone I talk to is like, they're like, I want the electric F-150. I'm like, that's great. You don't drive trucks ever. Why would you want that? But okay, sure. Make your next vehicle electric. Teslas have always been kind of like not a status symbol per se, but like a nerd cred kind of thing. And it's just so cool.
I think it has become a bit of a status symbol, though. I think once Sweetie drops it in a song, status, yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair.
No, but I think you make a good point. Yeah, like I think like to put what both of you are saying, like the tech has like met like the moment that we're in politically, where a lot of us are like, yeah, like older. I was gonna say older millennials, but not that. Just like mid-level millennials are at the age where we can, yeah, like really make decisions with our money, which I think is important. And then I think something you said, Steve, reminded me. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe California had announced earlier this year that they are phasing out sale of non-electric vehicles in the coming decade. But I might, John, does that sound familiar to you? I had read this in passing, but
5 rings a bell for some reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it passed, but I know it was being introduced.
Maybe being introduced. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that's like what I was trying to say. It might be like a example of where, yeah, like government has to like kind of like meet that consumer, like kind of like push the truck a little bit. I think someone else chimed in.
Yep, RCKLS928. Rumpelstiltskin is right. Electric vehicle growth was only facilitated by government, but consumers demanded electric cars, which drove the swelling demand. Absolutely.
There is one caveat to electric vehicles. in that it's completely worthless if you're getting all your electricity from coal and natural gas.
Exactly.
Because you're still putting in. And so there are two ways that we can go about that. One is OPEC is helping us out by continuing to keep oil supply low, which is going to.
OPEC, John? Sorry.
I'm sorry?
What is OPEC?
OPEC is an organization of petroleum exporting countries,
Yes.
I believe is the official name for the acronym. But it's basically all the Arab states, Venezuela, and Sudan, maybe. But it's a group of nations that controls a lot of the oil, and they effectively act as a cartel, and they control the prices. And they were hit really badly by COVID because people were traveling a lot less. Prices bottomed out to the point where you were actually being paid to take away crude oil last May. And so they've jacked the price and are holding it at about $70 a barrel. Just caused gas prices to increase, and it's just going to kind of further push that. And so it's kind of one of those things where, like, oh yeah, they want to punish America. Okay, great, we'll just go to electric cars.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Like, we think about how cars changed in the 1970s with the with oil rationing and all the issues with pretty much the oil crisis that, I mean, we were not alive for, but I have a whole docket of cars I secretly love. I hate to say, the Honda CRX is a vehicle that gets 50 miles to the gallon, I believe, or like 45 miles to the gallon, which is like unheard of. But that was what people were doing back at the oil crisis. Our idea wasn't like, okay, how do we negotiate our way out of this politically? We still had to adapt. So in such crisis, electric vehicles, the technology was not there. And I get it. I understand, like, we were not anywhere near electric vehicles back then. But now we are. Now we have so much of a technological advance in the past 40 years that if there are issues with oil supply and demand, just supply chain in general, logistics, to John's point, we have the technology. I hate to say it, we have the technology to address this. And like you said, we need to not have them powered by coal plants. So what do? OPEC, or we start to really aggressively solarize wind power, renewables to power these, the grid in which we feed our cars.
And nuclear. I am a big fan of nuclear. I know this one's an explosive issue. Both left and right seem to hate it. But it has to be the stopgap. And New York just closed down their last nuclear power plant, Indian Point. And, well, sure enough, overnight, we had a 30% increase in our carbon output.
Yeah.
And it's one of those, like, we don't necessarily need to build new, but we should do what it takes to sustain. We should not use natural gas as the gap technology. That's, I think, very, very dangerous game we'd be playing. We have nuclear. There's enough of it out there still.
I think... sorry, go ahead, Ingrid. Were you going to say something?
No, okay. I think that's where the difficulty comes from. It's like, like, with nuclear, the issue is, like, always, like, the risk factor, right? That's always there, but at the same time, it's the natural gas that's the risk now. And it's like, how are we going to mitigate the two? It's something that, always comes up in conversations among scientists. And it's a difficult problem, I think, because, there's the time element to what we're facing. Steve, were you going to say something?
I was, and then I forgot.
That's okay.
I was listening to, like, raptured and was like, what was I going to say again? Sorry. Sorry, nuclear. I have numbers on that. Nuclear is currently in the US, 20% of our electricity generation comes from nuclear. That has not changed over the past 20 years, I would say 20 years, since 2000. Whereas renewables have been growing. We've gone from 9% of our generation comes from renewables in the year 2000. We've only actually gone up to 19% in 20 years, which I actually was surprised by. I thought we thought we did better, but no. The one big takeaway from those numbers, though, is that, like you said, John, we're using natural gas as a stopgap, which I don't like. I know is being touted as a cleaner version of fossil fuel energy, but it's still fossil fuels, and it's not carbon neutral. It's not carbon negative. And on top of that, I think we went from like 50% coal to 20% coal, but that was all filled up by natural gas.
Yeah.
So, We do have another comment here, which is, I've heard that lithium batteries are a dirty source of energy, not mined in an ecologically sound way. Is that true? What are our options?
So I'm going to leave this one to the scientists, but yes, this is a huge concern. It's also, they take up a ton of space. They leak. So, I mean, you're talking about dirty fuels. Nuclear has its obviously very well-known issues. Natural gas, if anyone remembers 10, 15 years ago, with people setting their faucets on fire in Pennsylvania.
Oh God, I forgot about that.
It hits the groundwater, the fracking. Animal waste is, yeah, it cuts down methane, but it's a filthy process and takes up a lot of space on farms and kind of pushes the burden onto an already stressed industry. And lithium batteries do leak a lot. I know there's a couple companies out there working on hopefully cleaner batteries. I know there was one that was this company, I forget. Sorry, I should have written down all these names. But they came up with some sort of iron pellet battery that can supposedly hold a charge for something ridiculous like a month, and is about the size of a normal furnace in a house, and can be stored and used for rooftop solar, or probably more likely battery arrays for large plants. But actually, Steve, I know you were working on this during your master's degree. You were looking at alternate energy.
So
am I misremembering?
Sort of. Ingrid, actually, I know you work a little bit with batteries as well. We do a lot of battery adjacent work, but we don't necessarily work explicitly on batteries. So I know a little bit about the technology I could talk about, but Ingrid, I know you've been working on some stuff. Did you have anything you wanted to say on that recently?
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of mining, yeah, John said it right. Like it's a terrible process. So I'm going to link some, I'm trying to find the right article for you, Rumpelstiltskin, in the chat. But that talked about the way they mine lithium, which from my limited understanding comes from like the bottom of the ocean, and often subjects people to, like the folks who are mining lithium, to very dangerous working conditions. And oftentimes it's like one of those things where the end goal is in a way sustainable, right? We have this high power battery, but the methods to which we are obtaining this technology itself is not sustainable. So I actually didn't know about this iron pellet technology, but I'm going to look into it.
I'll find a link.
Yeah, that'd be great.
This is cool. But I do know they're also looking at other metals, so things like sodium, potassium, that are abundant as alternatives to lithium. Whether or not the technology is there yet is another question. Mostly just because, yeah, it's in the research stage, like the academic level, and that comes down to optimizing. Steve had mentioned we did battery adjacent work. And that's because when it comes to a battery, it's not just the material that's being charged, right, that we're considering. It's all the components that go into making the battery working. So like if you have like I don't think I've ever explained this before, so I might botch it. But basically, you have like the positive, negative end of your batteries, right? Anode and cathode. And you have an electrolyte, which is kind of like the medium through which charge or current electrons at the end of the day are flowing. And what happens with lithium is that they leak and they degrade because this electrolyte interaction is so poor. And it gets actually, like, if you think about something being liquid, it gets like solidified, kind of like gunky. Kind of think about like running dirty water through a pipe. Every time you do it, it's going to degrade the battery. So people are looking at that to help lithium ion batteries perform better. But then just, yeah, moving off lithium itself, because it is rare, because it is expensive, because it is mined in this terrible way, to things like sodium and potassium. There are other little things, like I know people are like zinc air batteries, which are a little like kind of like dinky science experiment you can also do at home, and a few other things. But I'm going to drop it for you in the chat in a second. I don't know, Steve or John, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, technologically speaking, so I know, like you said, the electrolyte is a big problem with batteries. And when you hear about leaking lithium batteries, the electrolyte is what's leaking. The lithium itself is not a liquid. But lithium is very flammable. If you've ever taken a pellet of sodium or put it in water, you hear it explode. Our chemistry teacher in high school did that far too many times to be sane. John and I went to the same high school. But yeah. Lithium is in that same class. It would do the same exact thing. It's very reactive with water. So there's a lot of concerns right there already. Lithium air batteries and lithium solid state batteries, we refer to them, using polymer electrolytes that are solid state or other types of materials, are often touted as being alternatives towards this electrolyte issue. In terms of metals, the one thing that always strikes me a lot, Ingrid mentioned sodium and also nickel are two that really come up a lot. as alternatives. We don't have sodium and nickel batteries really on the market yet because it's still a nascent technology. It's still being developed. The problem is lithium is just really good at holding a charge and dispensing a charge at the right rate. There's a lot of factors into what makes a good battery. And lithium's just, it's kind of like, do you weigh the risks versus the benefits? And I think we're getting to the point now where we're getting materials that really are beneficial and outweighing all the risks of lithium, that we can start using them. So I don't think we're far off. I think actually some technology is starting to use sodium-based batteries and nickel-based batteries. However, that now brings up the question, like, are these also okay to mine? Any metal that you pull out of the ground has to be mined. I know not just the safety considerations, but also like the cultural considerations. You talk about cobalt is now being considered like some sort of conflict metal because of the conditions under which it's mined, how you get it. I see a link about child labor toxic leaks. So yeah, that kind of comes into play. Like, how is this being mined? So you have to be conscious about that, and now we have to start weighing the risks of one versus the other. But yeah.
Also worth noting that since this has been in the news all weekend, Afghanistan has approximately $1.2 trillion worth of these metals that people are going to start looking to exploit. And so it's an area that's already war-torn, for the last 150 years. No one has improved it by being there, and a lot more people are going to be interested in it. Mm-hmm. So there's humanitarian crises as well tied up in all this.
Yep. Yeah. Now you're getting your people involved with your technology, and now it doesn't always have a nice, happy outcome. We have a lot of issues with understanding where our materials come from. So it's a good comment. We really appreciate it. A good question. Really gets us on a sour, dark note of talking about.
This is also stuff that seriously needs to be considered.
Exactly.
That's the big impediment to.
Mm-hmm.
Oil has obviously always been a conflict, but it's pretty much everywhere. And technology has been improving that we can get at it with deep sea mining or deep sea drilling and fracking. So you can be energy independent.
Yeah, and
if you're a large country.
Even in like maybe, I don't know if benign is the right word, but we're already seeing like the effects of material or elemental shortages now, right? Like with the semiconductor shortage, driving things like graphic cards and computer shipping times and prices up. So it's like we see these implications in maybe ways that we maybe take advantage of. Like, okay, just don't buy a graphics card this year. It's fine. But, when it comes to these precious metals, like, I don't know the correct word, maybe like geopolitical nature of like where we're mining these elements is just I don't want to use the word explosive, but like, yeah,
that's a good word for it.
Yeah. Has like these direct implications.
Mm-hmm.
One thing, if I may be, because I'm just become naturally optimistic the last couple of years. I don't know where it came from. I've always been a cynic and a pessimist.
This is good. Maybe it's with age, Some people become, grumpy old people. Yeah.
Or I've just like hit a point where I'm so cynical I've looped back around. But one thing that I've got like really excited about is the Japanese space agency landed the probe on the comet. Or the comet or comet.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of idea was like, all right, if we can capture this and even just like drop it on the moon, we have a mining operation there. It's not going to harm anybody. Yeah, someone's going to get fabulously wealthy on it if there's not a plan to really make it an international effort to do it. But that stops any need to be tearing up the Earth. And there's quadrillions of dollars of all these elements that we need and we use every day out in space.
Oh, I haven't heard about that.
We're not terribly far. There's actually a book written by someone called John Lewis about mining asteroids, but it's very much there were a couple of startups.
Here's our guest for tonight.
Not me, but I always support other John Lewises. It's definitely not a technology that's in the next 30 years, but I think within our lifetimes we'll be able to do it. There were a couple of startups that were looking at this, and Steve Scott would be a very good guest if we want to do an episode on space exploration and how it can help on Earth.
Might have to take him up.
But there were a couple startups, and they went under with the crash because there was just no way that we're really going to get within a good enough horizon. But there are definitely people looking at it and working on it, and I'm sure Elon Musk has plans that he's not divulged to us yet about capturing these asteroids and building the moon bases.
He'll be tweeting it soon.
Yeah. What a cruel joke of the universe. Hey, all those really expensive and useful metals you want, they're on a giant icy rock hurtling around the sun really fast every 70 years. Have fun getting those.
Catch. We'll send one to you every so often, but it'll burn up.
Oh my god. Oh, Jesus. Yeah, no, that's fast. I had no idea. I'm like, I kind of want to go look into this now. Like, I always heard of asteroid mining, but comets? That's wild. Oh my god.
It's a book I was written in the 90s. It's called Mining the Sky for anyone watching.
I'm gonna type that in the chat just so I remember. Honestly, mining in.
I'm sending the link right.
There we go.
And yeah, this one comment has sent us all the way.
Oh, I love weird stuff like that. That's just like so out there. No pun intended. That's gonna be the theme of this episode.
A lot of controversy about privatizing space, and I've been I myself am ambivalent on it. I was for a very long time entrenched in that NASA does space exploration, but I think the interest it's generating and just the amount, like how fast and how much cheaper and how more reusable rockets have become in the last 10 years. Like being able to land those boosters is huge, not only from a resource perspective, but just like how cool the science is. And I think kind of allowing low Earth orbit to become privatized, I'm still a little like it's going to get crowded up there, and we're going to have issues with satellites crashing into each other, coming down, possibly hitting things on Earth. But I still think we're going to benefit more because then governments can focus on the really deep stuff, getting people back to the moon, getting people on Mars, seeing if it's even feasible to capture asteroids and bring them back and solve our resource issues on Earth.
Was there, forgive me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there just an accord signed on Mercury recently? Or was that the metal Mercury? I read something in the news recently about Mercury. I wasn't sure if it was about the planet Mercury. I need to double check that.
Even though I have no idea what you're talking about, I can almost guarantee it's probably the metal.
Just double checking.
Yeah, it sounds like the metal.
I saw the word Mercury in the news. I'm like, all right, there's one or two things it could be, or three if we're talking about like Roman mythology.
Yeah.
They discovered like life amounts of phosphine, I think it was, on Venus. That might be what you're thinking space-wise.
Sorry, as phosphorus chemists, or previously phosphorus chemists, Ingrid and I can't get the smell of phosphorus out of my nose. It doesn't smell
maybe
good.
We could launch you to Venus, and then you'll smell it and then get nose blind to it.
Going back to the question, it's actually interesting, yeah, because one of the applications of phosphorus is actually for these battery applications as an anode. So that's another material if you're interested at home to look at. The hows and whys of that I'll leave for like beyond this chat. But it is, yeah, another one of those things that's just everywhere. It's bananas, basically.
Yeah.
Like, not bananas. What am I saying? That's potassium. But it's everywhere. The P's coming.
It starts with a P. It's the same.
Yeah.
No, for sure. I just think like a lot of it is, as we're saying, technology. The materials we use are. I mean, that's why we have jobs as scientists. That's what we're trying to do is make these things better. There's never a stopping point really for a lot of these technologies. There's always improvements.
Yeah, I think it's exciting is like rethinking even like our relationship to these metals and like the elements are like picking like rather than like the idea of like extracting these like precious metals that are inherently rare, looking at things that like I work on zinc and tin, so I can rep them very hard. But just these elements, nickel, cobalt, that are abundant and therefore recyclable, and they don't have implications to like once we actually like the I guess like the what is I'm not a supply chain person, like the end of life cycle for these materials coming from like not just like the application that we're using them for.
Which that comes back to like the whole lithium battery and recycling and how hard they are to recycle lithium batteries. And there's been a big push just to, well, figure out how the hell to do it, because it, one, reduces a lot of the burden on mining and all the issues with that. But two, it's such a waste of material when you just throw out a battery. So, but it's just very difficult to recover lithium. We've gotten a lot better with it now, and you can actually drop off batteries from laptops, etc. Usually at, I think, like Best Buy or something like that now, and they have a way to do it. But I would say like 6 or 7 years ago, that was not a thing. That was not a feasible thing to do. It was not worth the cost. So a lot of these things are just general development, incremental improvements as we go. That's why we have scientists working on these things, or policymakers that help to drive these things. We have some comments. JSig says, space law is a very fascinating subject on that note. Yes.
Yes, it is.
I know nothing about space, like law and technology. I just like reading about moon landings, but I could listen to it all day. And Rumpelstiltskin says, can't we just jettison the lithium batteries into space?
In about 10 years, it might be cheap enough to.
Oh my god.
Not bad.
I mean, at the rate things are improving, cost-wise.
So like silly of me, but if you've played Katamari, I just like imagined like a large rolling thing of battery material like floating around.
Eventually consumes Jupiter. Yeah.
I hope it's not what we're doing with our garbage, but it's just what I imagined when that comic came.
Now I have that theme song stuck in my head. Thank you. It's funny because it's like, as soon as we start talking about jettisoning things into space, I always get like a comical image. So you mentioned Katamari, and then John, you might appreciate this. I thought of, there's an episode in Futurama where they take a giant garbage ball and launch it into space, and then it becomes the issue 1,000 years later when it starts hurtling back at Earth, and they need to use another garbage ball.
I've seen this.
Like, oh my god. It's kind of not. That's something I mean, maybe John or Ingrid, or if we get Scott in here too, you guys can speak more to this. I don't know how I feel about space junk. Like, there's a point to which I see, okay, we launch a satellite and then it just dies in deep space past Jupiter. Do we care? Does it matter? And I think a lot of it is like, if you use space as a place to store waste, does it matter? What do you think? I honestly don't have an opinion on this, because I feel like part of me is just like, oh, but I don't want to like trash space. It's like, we don't trash
my
Earth.
reaction is like, as someone who like reuses plastic bags and trash, I feel like just like, so I'm just like, why would we do that? But maybe that could be like a whole episode on its own, talking about. Yeah, I feel like now I really want to read all of this, just kind of figure out.
Yeah, but even from just like a waste perspective too.
Yeah, I had a question to bring it back, but now I've lost it thinking about Katamari. But give me a moment, I'll think about it. Oh, I guess, I know that we had talked a bit about the policies that excite us, and like kind of like the things that kind of like struck out to us from the report. I think something that always happens, like when these UN reports come out, and maybe if you're watching at home and you don't have a science background, and these reports might be like the only instance in which like you engage with climate and the news this way. And like when I had friends who were like, what the heck? like this is it. It's over. It's doomed. But I feel like when I read the report, I think to like the point that you, Steve and John were making, I felt like maybe like a degree of, I don't know the right word. I don't think it's agency, but kind of like an ownership of like, like I think John, you're just like, we're like narrowing what needs to be done. But like it seemed less, I don't know if it's like a sign of resignment even as well, but like less overwhelming to the task of like, this is like, these are the steps that we need to take. And it's like, there's no question about it. We just need to do it. But I don't know how you guys feel like having worked in climate yourselves, or like, Steve, like as an engineer, kind of this influx of information when it comes to climate, particularly like with the amount of political attention it's getting now too.
John, do you want to take this one first? I have some thoughts, but
I guess the question is, how do you not feel so bad?
Yeah.
reading these reports. Yeah.
Well, I'm good at deluding myself. I think for me, it's focus back. It's the base human instinct to focus on the negative, the bad. And it's the survival instinct. If you're being chased by a lion in the wild, that's what you need to focus on. And you need to, like, the ones who are best focused on what was that noise in the dark were the ones who survived and they were able to pass on their genes. And so I think in many ways, one thing that really helped me through, and I don't want to get too personal, but cognitive behavioral therapy, which teaches you strategies of, all right, I can keep spiraling myself when you have an anxiety disorder, if you have depression or any of these issues, you can catch yourself. And it's something that just takes a lot of time to also train, like working out in the gym, like learning a new skill. And so I think in many ways, it's like, all right, I can't control the fires in the Pacific Northwest that are blotting out the sun. I can't do anything about the towns, the refugees. I have very limited resources right now, just having gotten out of grad school. But what I can do is say, all right, is there good in this? Well, yeah, a lot of people now are woken up. A lot of people's lives are affected, and it's home, it's here. People are definitely paying attention. It's every year we're getting the new record fires. So we have more people who are into it, more people who are going to be willing to accept sacrifices and political decisions, whereas before we didn't have that. This one's kind of wild, but the Australian fires, according to a study that was done by the, I can't even read my own handwriting, the Natural Center for Atmospheric Research. It actually turns out that those fires that killed all those koalas, had those awful images, and really kind of set us off right into the pandemic, actually had a net cooling effect on Earth for the year.
Is that from the particles, probably, that came from?
Wow.
And so these fires as well will probably have a net cooling effect. It's buying us months, but it's still something. And so it's just one of those things where it's like, all right, yeah, there's no way that the Senate in its current setup, even if you can convince, and I will give credit where credit's due, Joe Manchin has a plan that involves bringing the coal mine, like doing carbon capture and having the coal miners put it back in the ground. He's on it, but we still don't have enough votes for it. But you also have a lot of these others who are kind of on the fence, and we need their support, but they're not quite there yet, and they're not going to get a benefit to their constituents. That feels overwhelming. But what doesn't feel overwhelming is the fact that California, under a Republican governor, passed cap and trade. They passed a solar subsidy and halved their carbon output for energy, for electricity. And so you kind of capture, like, look for the wins, is, I guess, would be what I do, and kind of my advice, because it is very overwhelming and it's very easy to get overwhelmed. And I have complete sympathy for anyone who's just ready to throw in the towel and say, screw it, I'm just gonna, I'm throwing in, I give up. And there have been times in my life where I've been like, oh God, what am I even doing? What's the point?
Mm-hmm. No, I think, yeah, I agree with that entirely.
I try and do this, and if I'm going to pump my own Twitter, but JDMSL on Twitter, I tend to just forward articles that are, this is a win, in between a lot of sports talk. And so, like, you basically force yourself to be like, yeah, okay, everything's shit. I know it's shit. I don't need to focus on it being shit. Pardon my French, but there's no real other word for it. Where's the good? Where are the wins? What can I say to other people who feel disheartened or feel like, hey, this is going to destroy the economy? Well, no, people are making money and helping the environment. Where can I find these? Where can I make those connections? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a very philosophical answer to it, but I think it's one thing, and Steve can attest, in our friend Discord from high school, I'm always like, guys, come on, please get help, like, at some points, because you'll just see, like, it's so easy to spiral with everything that's going on. It's so easy to lose focus and want to fix everything. Pick one or two, and that alone, is more than enough in many ways for one person.
Absolutely. And to that point, actually, what I was going to say, I'm going to have a springboard off of you, take your beautiful talk and build my own off of it, as I do. So what's really difficult to do in policy is do research in policy. So you write a policy and say you have this beautiful idea for a law, plastic bags, let's say plastic bag bans. And you're like, I'm going to do plastic bag bans where I charge this amount of money for a plastic bag, and this much goes to the city taxes, as much goes to the store owners, etc. And then you try it out and it fails. People are bypassing it. Stores are kind of resisting it. There's a lot of issues. So nobody did this before you. I'm talking a little bit about Chicago. I won't go much into that, but Chicago had a lot of issues with their first bag ban because nobody had really done that before. It's hard to, like, you can't research how to do policy. You need to just kind of like have focus groups and like see how it works in small settings. But from there, bag bans exploded because people saw, okay, well, we want this, we want the benefits, but we don't want to do what they did. So we'll just learn from their mistakes and develop better policy. And John, to your point, we're getting wins. We're getting small wins, sure. But the first step is the biggest step, because let's say, okay, now we have cap and trade. Now we have all these benefits in Chicago, in California. Now nobody has to sit there. Nobody on the town council in, I almost said a Canadian town. Excuse me. Let's keep it American. A town council in Westchester is now sitting there like, all right, if we want to implement this, we don't have to just come up and reinvent the wheel. We now have the framework. We know that this works in these settings. These towns have had success with this. Neighboring cities have had success with this option. These are things to avoid. We now are getting like a textbook built up of what works and what doesn't for good climate policy. From the ground up, the simplest thing being bag bans, all the way up to cap and trade, just like simple things, all the way to much more integrated systems is the word, excuse me, all across the board. So these little wins, sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. I didn't want to interrupt you. Just that someone in the chat wanted to know a bit more about cap and trade, but we can.
Okay.
Beautiful speech. Yeah, I feel like John has a lot to say.
Yeah.
But we can let your beautiful speech go for it first. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
all I wanted to say was that.
You've referenced it a few times. So I just wanted to like.
No, it's all good. All I can really say is that these little victories it's a snowball effect. It's going to roll down the hill because now we don't have to worry about kind of finding the right path. We have options and now we can just start to implement them. It's going to vary city to city, area to area, but we have pretty much the resources within to work and make us reach the Paris goals. So, but yeah, it's not showing up super well on our chat, just in case.
I can let you know.
Okay.
So J6 asked if you can go a little bit more into cap and trade and why it's useful. They've always seen it as a system where bad actors can maintain behaviors as long as they have the money. And Rumpelstiltskin followed up just now asking where the UN fits into governing cap and trade.
Where the UN?
Yeah, the UN. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll start with cap and trade, and this is actually what I did my thesis on.
Oh, amazing.
Believe it or not, cap and trade, and I'll go a little through the history. Came from Yale School of Economics, guy William Nordhaus. And the idea is basically that when you produce something, you have, you know your cost to produce it. You got labor, materials, cost to advertise, transportation costs, etc. And it's based in this idea that there are also costs to society. This cropped up in the early 1900s, I think around 1920, that there's an added cost. And it was the example that was used was you have people hanging up their white sheets in the cities, and then they become gray. You just clean them, but they become gray. So now you have to clean them again because of all the soot that factories are putting out. So this is something called a negative externality. And so what happens with negative externalities is no one really notices because everyone ends up paying a couple of cents. And you don't really notice 2 or 3 pennies. But over time, it can accumulate. And that's what we're seeing with carbon. So what William Nordhaus did, he said, all right, there's a price to this carbon because of global warming, because of the damage it will do, that we have to pay eventually. We're paying extra money for Florida is flooded under Tropical Storm Fred right now. There are 2 more in the Atlantic, both of which are going to be threatening land within the next week. We'll be paying for that too. As these storms become more frequent and more powerful, we pay more and more. What carbon tax does is tries to preempt that. It says, all right, well, we're going to raise the money now. And the other side to this is as things get more expensive, it's also going to do something called induce innovation. which says, all right, if it costs me $100 to make this product that I can sell for 200, that's great. But I'm putting $150 worth of carbon damage into the atmosphere for every one of these $100 products I'm making. The carbon price itself basically adds that $150 in damage you're going to be doing to the cost of that. So you either raise costs and you'll lose your consumers, or you have to change the way you do it, so you use less carbon. And so this was first developed in like the early 1980s. Pardon, I'm sorry, wheels are turning a little bit. The early 1980s.
I love this history, not gonna lie. I had no idea any of this. Yeah.
And then was actually picked up by a lot of Ronald Reagan's economic team. And it was going through, and it was kind of one of those, back when Republicans and Democrats only disagreed, didn't hate each other. They began to kind of work together and said, all right, well, we know climate is an issue. And this was based more on the issue of acid rain, which is caused by sulfur dioxide being put out in the atmosphere. So they began to work together, and they created this thing called cap and trade, which basically says, all right, you can emit whole nationwide, we can emit a certain amount of sulfur dioxide. And that amount's going to get less and less every year. You can emit more if you want, if you pay for it. And we'll set this certain amount, we're going to auction it off. And so they passed this in 1990. It was signed into law by the first George Bush. And within 5 years, sulfur dioxide was like not a problem. Everyone forgot about acid rain. And I know I'm going to be dating myself, but it was like the big terror thing when I was a little kid. It's like, oh, it's the acid rain. And now it's like, well, it's no longer an issue. And so then people latched onto the idea. And I know Bill Clinton was looking at this, never got anywhere, because that's when things started to become more contentious. And so states began to look at it. And this was brought up by Arnold Schwarzenegger in California. And he said, all right, let's do it with carbon. It worked for sulfur. And so what they do is, again, they say, all right, all of California by 2020, we're going to say, cannot emit more than 365 megatons? No, megatons. Go with megatons. Number's not important. And said, all right, and we'll sell, oh, sorry, the cap was 385. They're going to sell up to 325. And so there's a gap that has to be closed somehow. And so what you saw companies start to do was clean up their, how much they were emitting, go for more efficient technologies, Energy Star, cooling the office less, turning off the AC during vacation times, turning off the lights. We saw more people installing solar. We saw, and it just kept coming down. Every year the cap lowers. I don't know how well that is explained. If you have questions, this is one of those things where it's like I can talk endlessly to it, but I'm not the best at quite explaining it to a new audience yet.
No, that's fantastic. Like, this is, I knew cap and trade, but like getting like a nice like history from the ground up is really fascinating. So we really appreciate it. I did just want to like say really quick, thank you so much to the 2 donors who donated.
Oh yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Yes,
Lindsay and Anonymous.
Your explanation was so good.
But absolutely.
Another alternative to pricing that is not quite as popular, but has been implemented, I know in the Nordic countries, UK has it, and Canada has it, which is just a straight carbon tax and says, all right, well, we know the damage is going to be $50 for every megaton that you're putting out into the atmosphere. We're just going to charge you now. And then that money can either cycle back to the people in the form of a dividend. Mm-hmm. And I know British Columbia does this, where they send everybody a $2,000 check every year. Or it can be used to fund programs. So there's like, it's a new revenue source that's going to go away once carbon emissions hit neutral, once we get it down low enough. So it can be used for whatever happens to be the need of a locality.
Awesome. I feel like I've always, I think have known like cap and trade and carbon taxing in the frame of like, I think similarly to, I forget who in the comments had said it, that they are there, but that, tends to be this kind of like vague, is it useful, is it not useful thing? But this breakdown of it is super, super helpful.
So as far as use, I think it's definitely proven effective. And since these programs went into effect in Europe, as well as the United States, our carbon emissions have gone down since they were implemented. And that includes when you adjust for all the outsourcing we're doing
Yeah.
of our production.
I think then, sorry, Steve, if you're going to say something.
Sorry. Yeah, we just have another part of the question was, sorry, as well was, I've always seen it as a system where bad actors can maintain behaviors as long as they have money. So is there, I understand that you're paying extra, but is there any way to like handle that? Is that as big of a problem as it sounds? What exactly do we do?
I would say no. And one thing to always remember about ultra capitalists is that it's profit at all. Like that's number one. And so at some point it will just become too expensive. One thing that will cause an issue is for very high polluting industries that are not going to go away, like concrete. They will need additional subsidies to kind of push their technology to a point where it can become sustainable. And whether that's just giving them a subsidy for building a carbon capture plant when that technology starts to scale up this decade, we don't know. But this was actually an issue that came up in the Netherlands, where you had a bunch of companies who can't meet it. And so they're either just leaving the Netherlands so they can go pollute in Poland or going under. And you don't get the opportunity to innovate within that because they have no means of doing it. So the most effective way to implement it is kind of all right, here's the stick, and the carrot is going to be, all right, we can give you a break if you're investing in these technologies.
Someone in the chat just asked.
Jethro Tull says, concrete is a polluting industry. How so? So I might not be super privy to how concrete works, but I believe in the curing process, it actually emits CO2. That's how it goes from a rock. You activate CO2 with water. It's actually a chemical reaction which creates this like solidified bulk rock. And over the course of several weeks, curing can take, I think, up to a month, depending on I almost said breed of concrete, excuse me. And then I almost followed up with species of concrete. Type of concrete. It's been a long day. Genre of concrete. It could take up to a month to cure, and it'll just be emitting CO2 during that time. It's like as it's hardening and just generating this gas. So it is a very high polluting material. But I mean, it's not, like as John said, it's not going to go away because it's the best building material for a lot of applications.
We have a housing crisis.
Yes. So what is the benefit versus the risk here? Do we use less stable materials for building houses where we live and have immediately risk at harm, or do we limit the emissions from CO2 from our building materials in general?
And I think there was a question about how the UN factors in.
Ah, yes.
Oh yeah, there was. I forgot about this. Yeah. Thank you.
So right now, carbon taxes, the best way you're going to do it is the same way we do tariffs. And that is just say, all right, certain polluting, and EU just did this, and I believe Biden's trying to do it as well. We're going to say, all right, certain polluting products or places we know are polluting, we're going to just slap an extra charge on you. That way it'll equal to our carbon tax. So we're not bringing in, there's no benefit to import products because you can make them cheaper and pollute more. That is probably the mechanism by which the world is going to align. So it'll be through the World Trade Organization, not necessarily like, it'll be through the World Trade Organization. We're going to basically create the rules that will allow countries to align their carbon taxes. And we're already starting to do this with corporate taxes, looking at a corporate minimum amongst the G20 nations.
Sweet.
My audio froze for a second. Did end when you had said, I heard corporate tax and that was it. I don't know, sorry about that. Yeah.
They're looking to align corporate taxes through, it's almost positive it's the G20.
Okay.
They'll have a minimum, and so that'll be just the next step. Once they prove that works, they'll go through carbon almost assuredly.
I see. That's why I feel like we've walked through so many levels of it tonight, starting really small and with Boise, Idaho. I don't know if Rumpelstiltskin, you were tuning in at that time, but talking about it from that framework all the way up to the UN. But I think just showing, like I think it goes back to what you're saying, John, whatever work you are doing and whatever it's at, that there's like one thing you can focus on that itself has like a large component um, that really adds to it. I had a question that was somewhat related, but and this is another one for John. I don't know, Steve, you have also perspective on this, but something that I've been trying to do more of my own education about are like community utility programs, particularly community solar. I don't know if you have any working knowledge of this, but I was trying to think of like what is the framework then? Should it be like combo cap and trade, carbon tax, and movement to renewables? And through this this like capitalist lens, that's really never going to truly motivate in the like from a maybe from like the heart a movement towards renewables. How should we be going about that transition in a way that is a fast enough, but also b um, prioritizes people who like transitioning to solar itself is like so expensive, and like who should be fronting the cost of that? Is it communities, is it government? I don't know if you had any thoughts.
I think it's dependent on the locality. And this, again, is just something that's been lost in politics that hasn't always been. And I'm just thinking, like, going back to when I was born, California was a red state. So we have not had the national parties the way we do now. And I think in many ways, this is something the internet has really destroyed in American society, where we had a Democratic governor of Arkansas in my lifetime. And so I think it just depends. Everyone has certain priorities and certain beliefs in what they think is most important and what they think should be done. And we kind of cluster in communities. So New York is probably going to focus, I think, again, you're not going to try and put too much solar in Manhattan. Queens, the Bronx, where you have the smaller houses where people will actually own their building and they can put solar up. I know it's kind of a waffly answer. So the good answer I'll give is you need everything. Every policy has its place. Some are going to be better than others in certain places. California is going to do really well with cap and trade and induced innovation because they have that culture of looking forward, building the future. New York is a bit more traditional. We'll probably end up doing more of a combination, and we already do this. We are actually part of a cap and trade that covers 10 states from Virginia up to Maine.
Oh, I didn't know.
Called RGGI, or the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And states drop in and out of it all the time, so it's not quite as reliable and strong, but it's there. We did have for a while a solar subsidy. It was a green subsidy program where if you buy through a company like Green Mountain, you buy your power, the state will send you a $20 check every year. And yeah, it's nothing, but it feels good to get that check. And you're like, all right, cool, I'm going to go get a beer.
Yeah, exactly. 2 Chipotle meals, a nice drink.
And so I'm not going to be able to put solar panels up on my apartment because there's 4 layers of people above me, but I can at least choose to purchase my power from a company that's investing in only green.
Yeah.
So I think it's really reliant on people who are on the ground, the underground activists, to know their community and know their best option for their community that their community can put into effect, and then build that onto the policy. New York City may need more of a subsidy policy, whereas California might want more of a top-down,
Yeah, I don't think that's a waffly answer. I think it's a great one. It reminds me, are you familiar with Professor Catherine Hayhoe from like a UT school, but I can't remember which. But in essence, she's a political scientist and climate scientist. But she recently gave a talk that I listened to where she also framed climate in this way, where climate policy doesn't have to just be about, I think, the way that it doesn't have to be an ideological thing, like whether or not you agree with the science or agree with, protecting the environment or whatever it is. It's like all these little issues all relate to it, whether it's like infrastructure, economic policy, water policy, health policy, all of these things come together. And so because she lives in a state, I mean, she lives in Texas. So having these conversations are, I kicked my table by accident, a bit more difficult. But then, sometimes even removing the word climate from the conversation. But at the end of the day, if you're moving in the right direction, the policy is a policy. So I think that's the right answer. Yeah. I mean,
for what it's worth, it's one of the largest states for wind production. I believe they are actually the largest in
The
terms
largest, I
of
believe,
gigawatts. So every state has its thing.
Thanks to
Yeah.
T. Boone Pickens. Oh God. No, that's a good point. Just the general idea that these things all vary. So you have top down for California, you have wind in Texas. What do we do for New York, especially where Manhattan? Just say Manhattan. Like, where does the power come from? We have all these power plants around us, but they're all very in scale, smaller footprint than, say, solar and wind farms. And I know there's a lot of issues with wind in general, and people will yell and kick and scream about putting wind on the Long Island Sound. I don't see what the problem is about having offshore wind for Long Island or in our area as well. But then this comes down to my problem here is who is responsible for this? So we have a lot of people doing rooftop solar. In California, that was an easy thing to do. We hit price parity very quickly. It made sense from like a personal standpoint, like you had motivation. We don't have that opportunity here. The payback period on the East Coast is still very weak, especially on the northern half of America. Honestly, like New York, our sunshine hours are just not strong enough for the current cost of technology to really justify it yet. So does this fall on local government, state government to bring larger scale arrays of solar and wind power to power our homes? Or does it fall on us to find ways to either, like John said, buy into greener companies who invest in other areas or to implement rooftop solar? I know we have opportunities now where you can now rent or lease your panels to put on your house, so you're only paying a flat fee, you don't have any of the risks. Sure, but I personally think that we need a lot more investment from the top in these sort of situations. We need a lot more push in higher up government, state government, towards more generalized distribution of renewable energy in New York, at least in New York State for sure. I think we're really bad at that in this state. We're getting better, but
Yeah, I think there's a third option, which maybe my background might allude to a bit, but I do think we can also just make the fossil fuel companies pay for it. I think that requires government help because it's the people who create the problem. If I ran up to you and like, crash your car, like you'd probably make me pay for it to some extent. But I think, I think there needs to be accountability from both ends in that way. Yeah.
Absolutely. I just don't feel comfortable saying that it has to be on the consumer at all costs of this. I think we need a lot more push from, like you said, all sides here. So that's my thought.
I think, government subsidies certainly they work, and so there's no really other way about it. Give people money, they'll do the right thing. I would say for New York specifically, we're going to end up with a lot of resistance to windmills just because of the way people are, especially in the Long Island Sound. Off the Atlantic,
you two are from Long Island, so you can speak more about.
But again, where does the onus lie? And this is one thing that I have had very strong disagreements with for some people who sit politically to the left of me, in that in many ways the 1% and the top, like the 2 through 20%, have about the same amount of wealth. And when you're talking top 2 through 20%, that's white suburbs in New York, outside Philadelphia, Long Island, Westchester, Connecticut. Those are people we can start really kind of pushing and saying, all right, we're going to raise your property taxes, put solar on your roof, and you'll get a reduction. Hitting, like, it's obviously we should be very cross with Exxon and all that. And I think a lot of these lawsuits, especially with the precedent that was set by Shell, will start that process.
Yeah.
But that's half of the current wealth gap. And when you look at, again, who is raiding the Capitol, they're flying there in private jets, they're owning businesses. These are not the poor, downtrodden, white working class. These are the people who are still benefiting and are kind of forgotten about in the conversation. And that the Democrats also kind of dance around a little bit because they need that basis support as well. Because that's what all of the middle class should be. And if we took everything from the 1%, we would bring about 50% of the country to where the average Long Islander is. But right now, we also kind of need to take a little from them just to bring up the very poor and kind of help them get to at least a place where they're not worried and they can actually start thinking about climate and they're not worried about when their next paycheck is coming.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of those issues. It's extremely hot button because you, in many ways, look at, Steve and I grew up pretty much down the road from each other. Our parents, professionals, they both worked, both made very good money. And then you see like, oh, Jeff Bezos has all this extravagance and, he's launching himself into space. Why should I pay for anything? Well, you should. There's still, we still have, and we may only need to lose 10%, whereas Bezos would lose 50. But that's going to need to be something that kind of drive it. So this is something that California did to kind of bring back to that. They passed something called the Million Solar Roofs. And they said, all right, we can dedicate $3 billion in tax incentives for people to put rooftop solar, and we're going to sell it as, just a money-saving program. Well, it costs way more money to put rooftop solar than you're going to save in the 20 years that those panels will be existing. But, the government's going to give you a huge tax break on your property taxes. Mm-hmm. There we go. We've gotten the people who should be paying more to pay more. We've made it fair so that they feel like they're getting a good deal. Everyone's won. So I think policies like that are what states, especially wealthy blue states, should focus on. For other places, and we'll take a poorer state like Louisiana, that should be one where we work either through private companies using federal grants, which is another thing I would love to come back and talk about a bit more. I know perilously little, but just enough about how it works, how America is basically the only country that's been able to really create this system where we just innovate everything away and have kind of just accepted that technology will solve our problem. But a state like Louisiana would come up with a company that'll do this grant. We work with the locals, who just don't want to get flooded out, and say, all right, we can build tidal power that will also have the effect of lessening just ever so slightly the amount of storm surge you get and generates energy. That tech's not quite there yet, but that's a channel we can kind of go through and work with the people of Louisiana, get them excited and really open the opportunity to them. And speaking on opportunity, I think so much of it is available and has become available, and we still have very stubborn issues with mobility because it's not well advertised. It's not well known, a lot of these programs, just how easy it is to get the money. And there may be community organizations that dedicate their entire time to helping, small businesses in disadvantaged communities get these grants, $250,000 in seed money for some, a high school kid up in Harlem who works on the robotics team came up with an idea. Is it patentable? Well, yeah, let's get him a grant. Let's see if he can get some of that money. So I think as far as action goes, where can responsibility lie? It's everywhere. And it's a matter of, all right, open opportunities and make sure everyone knows the opportunities are there, while at the same time getting people, either tricking people or just forcing them, depending on the culture of the state, into helping.
I wouldn't even. Oh,
sorry. Go ahead, Steve. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I wouldn't even call it tricking because I think you could also frame it as an investment. I mean,
yeah.
I don't think anybody really forgets Sandy. Like Hurricane Sandy changed a lot of perspectives about living in New York, in especially these neighborhoods, especially the neighborhoods on the water, where livelihoods became at risk because of hurricanes. And now we're approaching literally, last year we had a record number of hurricanes. This year we're going to break that record supposedly. I hope we have enough.
We fell off pace, but
we fell off pace.
Yeah, it's still going to hurt. And this region is affected by hurricanes. So climate change causes these effects in hurricanes and storms, and it's going to affect water levels. Right from the UN report, we're going to see large rises in the sea level. Regardless of what we do, we're already past that point. We're at least going to have at least a meter rise of water, which is significant when you talk about, because it's a meter rise straight up. So think about how much of the beach that covers going this way. It's a lot, and a lot is going to be devastated for people who live in these areas. So think of it as this is now a tax, but it's your investment to protect what you have. That's the way I see it.
Never recovered.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I was gonna say, I think similarly to like what you were saying, Steve, it's just like that framing. Like it's a tax, but it's also an investment, right? It comes back. And I think that's where a lot of people get lost when it comes to climate. It's like, it's like, okay, I'm gonna like, so what if I like drink out of plastic straw? Like who cares? But at the same time, like, that's like, but if everyone makes a single decision, it's kind of like a collective action that adds up, whether or not it's like, like something, I know like plastic straws is like, one thing, but investing in infrastructure in your home, all that is another thing. I think that's something that things like moving on to what people can do is like things that like the youth climate movement has really been good at communicating to people that, like they're skipping school, they're and that message is like, two front, like one's like, like why would we go to school if our future's not going to be there, but also just like the urgency of like, this is what we need to do right away. And maybe it's just like, one kid skipping school, but then it turned into like a whole movement of like people doing it worldwide can really have like a huge impact. And I think while climate action, like, work obviously wasn't new, but really just like maybe put it to the forefront of people's mind in a way that I think that boring adults and like people in suits probably didn't, which I know is terrible that we need to like see kids doing this to do so, but I think did make the problem like front and center for a lot of people. Yes, if you're watching, you have kids, do something. Yeah.
So is that bringing us back to, I guess, to close up the talk on what you at home can do and what we can do in general in regards to what we now have as, from this UN report, a much more narrow, focused idea of what we're up against, where we can go, and kind of a spark of hope that we could do this. We could cease warming before 1.5C. It just takes a lot of effort. So do you guys have any thoughts, takeaways right off the bat that, I mean, Ingrid, you mentioned a lot about youth striking, etc., but any other thoughts on what you could do as a single action as an individual or a collective action as a society?
John, you can go first.
All right.
Okay. So I'm going to say, as a single individual, the best thing you can do, other than just taking stock of your own abilities, where can you cut? Even if you just do one, if you do one meatless day, if everyone in America did one meatless day, they'd cut it by 1/7. Our emissions from cattle output. But I would just say, pick something. If there's something that may have caught your ear on this podcast, something you read in the news, latch onto it, and then latch onto your strengths. Are you an entrepreneurial type? Can you sell something? Maybe then look and try and find some engineers and build a startup. Are you somebody who's very passionate about, working with disadvantaged people in your community? Plant trees, open a community garden, anything that will have a cooling effect on a community. And I know this was big in the news last month, where it's the neighborhoods that don't have trees are always poor and always people of color, almost like 100% of the time. So, that's something, and trees are cheap. And it's something you can do on a weekend. It builds community camaraderie, and you can stack from there. If you're a researcher and you're familiar with you doing chemistry, find a battery. Really just kind of introspect. And it doesn't even have to take that much time. Really, an hour a day tops, and you're going to have like huge impact. Another thing you can also do is just relentlessly call your local representatives, town, city council. They respond. Actually, Steve, you'll be happy to hear I got Lee Zeldin to respond to an email, not about climate at all, but so they are listening. Your congressional representatives, your senator probably not, congressional representatives, your city people, they're listening. They want to hear from you. And to kind of bring it back to, again, my own experiences growing up in the suburbs, there's always one or two loud people who shut down any conversation about doing something good for the community. So counter them, because then suddenly it's two people who are arguing, and then more people will start to speak up.
100%. I just like co-sign everything John said. I feel like, yeah, if you're an individual, I think the only two things I'd add are if you have the capacity I think donating to climate organizations, things like Sunrise, Sierra Club, 350 New York City. I'm obviously going to plug our donations here, community, especially community organizations that are doing work like, yeah, like locally in New York City, whether, you know, it's ours, which would be obviously thrilled to have your donation, but in New York, groups like We Act for Environmental Justice, for example, is an amazing work that's based up in Harlem. um, Donating your time if you're able. I think John mentioned, like, if it's just an hour a week, a month, it's still something. A lot of these community organizations need that. They just need an extra person to do something. Um, and then the other thing is also look like locally to in your neighborhood, as John had mentioned, but also if you're a student and you're a college campus, a lot of schools now are getting things like office of sustainability or sustainability officers. And universities have an unfortunately large stake in the industries that are quite polluting. And it's kind of like a feedback loop. Do you know what I mean? Like this money is funneling through in ways that I think are incredibly pervasive. And whatever you can do to even like start having that conversation with your friends or like your school sustainability office again, big thing you can do. Just keep talking, basically. Yeah.
And I'll add, if anyone's interested in lawsuits specifically, Natural Resource Defense Fund has been doing quite a bit of that. So if that's if you want to really target the corporations with donations, that's one you can do.
Sweet.
And the last thing I'll pitch too is September. If you're in the city, September is Climate Month. There is the end of the month is really like the big week where there's a lot of Climate Week programming, particularly the Youth Climate Strike, which is coming back, which is where we were 2 years ago, which is going to be like, you know, about raising noise, especially like just with this report coming out a month ahead of it, the urgency of the situation. It also overlaps with Voter Registration Day on college campuses. You know, check your registration, register someone to vote, and yeah, just get out there. I think whatever you can do, even if it's one thing, really can mean a lot.
Yeah. The only things I can really add to this. Oh, sorry.
Too.
The two of us are like, let's do it all.
It's very easy to sit and doom scroll. And if you get out there for an hour, you're going to feel great. Like even just doing the smallest thing. Yeah, and I can very much attest to that. This is why I do volunteering with Rupeethon. Why I keep this in my life constantly is because you just feel good.
I always feel great. I always feel great in that last dungeon of Link's Awakening. So yeah, the two things I'd like to add, because you guys make great points. I co-sign all of them. I love them. Just two things that really strike me are so John, you mentioned at the very beginning, cutting meat 1 day a week. That was a big thing for me. I actually read a book by Jonathan Safran. I'm butchering his name. He's an NYU professor, writer. He wrote Incredibly Loud and Jonathan
Oh God, why am I butchering it now?
You know the book. I can't.
I do know the book.
Yeah. Oh my God, I'm butchering it. I apologize. He wrote a book.
Incredibly close.
Yeah, exactly. There we go. I was gonna say like dangerously close. He wrote a book called We Are the Weather, which is a personal book.
I have heard about this.
Yeah, it's a very personal book talking about his experience with climate, which is an interesting perspective from a lot of the science books I've read. But his entire focus is just like, hey, if you cut meat for breakfast, that's it. Or if you only have meat for breakfast and no other meals of meat in the day, and everybody that would be a massive cut in our emissions. And a lot of it was focused on beef and pork. I actually, at this point, don't eat beef anymore, and I'm trying to cut out more meat in general, just because like that's the thing I want to do for climate, but also for general health as well. So that's like a big thing to think about. Is just what you eat is really important to the environment and where you're getting your food from. We talked with Omar for a long time about that. That does still have a big climate impact. And the last thing I would bring up on this is look up where does your energy come from. That's actually something I never really thought about. Was I found this out later. I think most unfortunately a large portion of when I was growing up on Long Island, the energy came from coal, natural gas plants, but then I found out like 10% comes from landfill gas, which I was like shocked. I was like, that's our only renewable source. Okay, but at the same time, I didn't know this, and I don't think anybody really knows what the makeup of their energy consumption is. So I would say look into that, and then follow up, like with John saying, going to your local representative, like Ingrid said, getting involved with local communities, understanding where this comes from, and seeing what you can do to improve towards more renewable energy, whether it be writing to representatives, working with your community, etc. Yeah, it always shocked me. I had no idea. I could talk all day about how terrible methane is. By the way, methane's still a really terrible greenhouse gas. And one of the main takeaways from the report I read, just to wrap it up, is if we target methane first as well and like eliminate methane, we have an even greater chance, because methane is far more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is, and we emit a lot of methane, far too much. Yeah, methane stinks, says J6. It doesn't. We just add sulfur to it to make it not to make it detectable.
So it doesn't blow up your house.
Yeah, and as someone who is literally a sulfur chemist, a sulfide chemist, I know all the scents of sulfurs.
Yeah, as someone who sits in the office next to his, it smells terrible.
I could identify all the different sulfurs. Anyway, that's all I really had to say. Did you guys have any other things you wanted to leave off on in particular?
The only thing I'll say is, yeah, no, thanks to everyone who donated again. So you raised another $15, which is super nice. And yeah, thank you, John. I feel like I kicked something again, but I learned so much listening to you talk about policy, and I feel like I have a lot of like reading points from tonight. And yeah, if anyone is still watching, you can still donate at any time.
Yeah, this is open. It's a live link.
Yeah, just keep giving money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
And
yeah,
yeah,
thank you so much for having me on.
No, John, it's been a blast. This is fantastic, and I had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun talking about the promise of climate action. So, yeah.
There's a lot to be positive about. You just need to really look for it.
Mm-hmm. Find those small victories, everyone. And yeah, with that, I think we'll all wish you a good night. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you again for donating, and we will see you all next week. And have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Bye-bye.